Back with Matthew Pose, and we're doing our third video topic on loudspeaker directivity. This time we're going to be focusing on finding the loudspeaker sweet spot. How you doing, Matt?
I'm good, and that's right. And I think that people are going to be surprised, but I will say the focus of this one is probably a little bit more towards narrow dispersion, which I know has been controversial in past ones, but I think people will be surprised by what they learned in this.
So what is the sweet spot of the loudspeaker? What is you hear audiophiles saying you got to set it up so you have the best sweet spot. What does that mean in actuality?
Yeah, I think so. I like to think of it as having two prominent features. The sweet spot is the point in the room where you're getting the best tonal balance from the speaker. And I think in any well-designed speaker, whether it's wide dispersion or narrow dispersion, there should be a very wide range of spaces in which you can sit in which the tonal balance remains the same. In other words, the frequency response is the same as it is on axis, and hopefully it's flat. But the other one, which I think is the more common problem and the more important one, is it's the point at which the center image is in the right place. So with most speakers, the only place where the center image is in the right place is if you're sitting directly between the speakers.
Basically equidistant from each speaker.
Right. But
so
that doesn't always have to be true.
That creates the phantom center is what we always hear people talk about.
Right. And something that people need to keep in mind as we go through this is that the phantom center is just one of many phantom images that are created in a sound system. So you have pans, meaning that phantom image is moving across in different places, even though you've only got the two speakers. But actually in a surround system, phantom images are created between the speakers. So in a surround system, there's a phantom image between the left and the center and the right, but also the right, left, and the surround speakers. There's phantom images involved in those pans. So as we talk about this, hopefully people can kind of start to understand how important it is that we maintain these phantom images, even if we're not talking about a stereo system.
Okay, so you prepared a slideshow as we always do with these series. Mm-hmm. I'm going to open this up now, and I'm going to also link up the other two parts on loudspeaker directivity that we've already done on YouTube and Facebook, so you guys can kind of reference that if you like on your own time. And let me know if you see everything here.
Yeah, we're good. I think you can hide that thing on the bottom. There we go.
Yep. So this is that.
Directivity and the sweet spot. You've probably had it wrong all these years.
All right.
All right, so directivity control and hearing. So as we're going to learn as we talk more about this, directivity control can be used to widen the sweet spot rather than narrow it, which I think is the opposite of what most people think. A perfect speaker simply gets quieter as you move off axis. The response remains identical. It just isn't as loud. Now, when I say perfect speaker in this context, I'm referring to a perfect controlled directivity or constant directivity speaker. Obviously, a very wide dispersion speaker that is perfect would have the same response and not get quieter. But in this case, I'm talking about a controlled directivity speaker. So a perfect one simply gets quieter as you move off axis. There's no change in response. Real speakers, though, have wider dispersion at lower frequencies, and this is okay. So in the top graph that I'm showing you there, that's a perfect ideal speaker. The directivity index of that speaker would be flat all the way down to 20 hertz and below. Such a speaker really doesn't exist. Most speakers, what happens is as you get into the lower frequencies, they become more omnidirectional. And a lot of people think, then what's the point of trying to control dispersion if you have this very uneven directivity index? Well, there's a reason for this. Good speakers have good directivity control down to at least 1 kilohertz. Really, it's better when directivity control is maintained down to 500 hertz. The reason why 500 hertz is so good is that at this point and below, we really aren't sensitive to discrete reflections anymore. 1 kilohertz is sort of the point where that point and above, that's where the vast majority of the action is happening, if you will. That's where all the discrete reflections in the room are very audible. We're very sensitive to those. And so that's why it can be important to provide some directivity control there. The benefit of a controlled directivity speaker is really most beneficial from that point and above.
Well, also below 500 hertz, that's the room transition region, and that's where you're dealing with hearing the standing waves more than anything else, right? The room is actually dominating the response.
Yeah, and of course, once you get into the actual FS of the room, you're going to be at a point where it's nothing but room. But in that transition region, yeah, exactly. And that's why we don't really hear those discrete reflections, is because we're really hearing the room quite a bit.
Okay, and then you have a link here for Getty, a white paper on directivity if people want to kind of take a look at that for more information.
Yep, and these images were taken from his paper with his permission, just because I didn't want to recreate these. He did a good job.
Okay.
So the effect of dispersion on imaging. So with both stereo and surround systems, the balance between speakers and the phantom image created between the speakers depends on the intensity and timing of the sound perceived from each speaker. In other words, the way that we create that phantom image from two speakers depends on how far apart each of those are and how loud they are. So a balance control, for instance, changes the volume of the left and right speaker, and that shifts the image left or right, even though the timing remains the same. Now you can also delay the left or right speaker, and that also shifts the image. This is important for the stuff we're going to talk about later.
So you could, you guys at home, like I do this all the time. When I sit in the money seat and I'm just listening to 2-channel, I'll vary the level just on one speaker, on the left or the right speaker, and it does just that. It changes where the image is coming from. It's amazing how when you're in that very sweet spot of that speaker, just changing the level or changing the delay by tenths of a foot can change that phantom image.
Right. So the next point we're going to make related to this, you reminded me I need to be more clear on what I mean by. So I said, assuming wide dispersion is you move closer to a speaker, the sound arrives to your ears earlier and the sound intensity increases. So something to keep in mind. When I say closer, I'm referring to lateral position. So you've got your left and your right speaker, you're dead center. You've got like your seat and maybe a seat to your left and a seat to your right. If you move to the seat to the left, if you're on a couch, you slide over, you've become closer to the speaker on the left. Mm-hmm. What happens then is that speaker becomes louder because you're closer to it, if it's a wide dispersion speaker, and because you're closer to it, the timing difference becomes greater. That one is now closer to you, sound arrives to you quicker, and the other speaker, of course, is farther from you. It's quieter and sound takes longer to arrive. Those two properties shift the image with you. So with a pair of speakers, as you move closer to one, you get farther from the other. The reverse is true for the other speaker, which I just explained. And this is known as time intensity trading. And it works for things other than speakers. You know, that concept actually goes beyond speakers quite a bit. But for our purposes, we're talking about this in terms of speakers and how it affects imaging.
Gotcha.
Okay, so the effect of dispersion on imaging. So you can take the advantage of the intensity trading and the speaker dispersion. So in other words, if we have a speaker that gets quieter as you move off axis, then we can aim them in a particular way that allows us to keep the center image stable. So if a speaker has narrow dispersion, then as you move closer to that speaker, it actually gets quieter, not louder. And the reason it gets quieter, even though you got closer, is because you moved farther off axis. And so controlled dispersion means the speaker is getting quieter as you move off axis. So when you aim them correctly, what happens is that you move more off axis to the speaker you're closer to and more on axis to the speaker you're farther from, meaning the farther speaker gets louder, the closer speaker gets quieter, but because you are also getting closer to one and farther from the other, essentially what happens is it all kind of balances out and the center image stays exactly where it's supposed to.
Interesting. Okay. And these are, you're showing here the HSU, those are coaxial 8-inch, I think, right?
Yeah, I think you can't see it in the image, but right next to me here is another coaxial speaker from JTR that we're reviewing, the Noesis 110HT, and this speaker has the same properties as the CCB8 from Shu. And so basically what these types of speakers can do, waveguide speakers, a lot of different types that have these properties, is that they have that ability to get quieter as you move off axis, so you can use them like this. So Shu had recommended taking advantage of time intensity trading to produce a more stable image. It actually had a wider sweet spot when used in this way.
Gotcha.
So this is an image where I'm trying to depict for everybody what's going on. So here you've got two people sitting next to each other, listening to the same pair of speakers. Now, it looks like these speakers are really, really far apart. That's just because I had to deal with the limited space on the slide. But just imagine these speakers being positioned normally. And what it's showing you is that for each of these people, because these are normal wide dispersion speakers, they see the center image as being in front of them. Even though one of them is sitting center and one of them is sitting off center. Really, ideally, both of them should be getting a center image in the same place where that yellow block is. And Gene, you mentioned actually, so in our homes, we can sit easily in the sweet spot. So this is not usually a big problem. But in our car, we never can, right? Like the sweet spot would be
Mhm.
where the armrest is. And so what happens is that very frequently the center image either doesn't exist, that's very common in cars, or it does exist, but it's actually sitting in front of you on the stage of the dash, if you will, where really where it should be is the center of the dash, which would be over to your right, for Americans driving.
And what most car companies do to compensate, because they want everybody to have somewhat of a center image, is they typically put a center channel where they do left plus right to try to anchor that a little bit. But sometimes they put it too loud. So if it's at the same level as the main speakers, then nobody gets good imaging.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it really needs to not call attention to itself. It just needs to help anchor it. And so, yeah,
More like
often
a
those
center
systems.
fill. It should be more like a center fill, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. So, why does wide dispersion change volume? Well, if a wide dispersion speaker is defined as one whose volume doesn't change with angle, in other words, the response is consistent in level and frequency response at every angle, then why does the person sitting closer to one speaker hear it as louder and farther speaker quieter? And that's because it's farther away. So when you're farther away, it must get quieter. Every doubling of distance reduces the intensity of sound to 1/4 of what it was, and this change in intensity causes the phantom image to shift with you.
Mm-hmm. And you're saying this is less of an effect when you have narrow dispersion.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to talk about that in the next couple slides. But yeah, basically, that's okay. With narrow dispersion speakers, that ability to get quieter as you move off axis means that you can aim, as I was saying earlier, you can aim them such that as you move to the left and you're getting closer to that left speaker gets quieter, but the right speaker actually gets louder because you're now more on axis to the right speaker, more off axis to the left speaker, and the center image stays put. So this is time intensity trading. And you've asked a lot about this. People get this wrong a lot because it's a really confusing topic. So I'm trying to show what it looks like here. So going back to what I was saying earlier, because they're aimed so extreme, they're crossing in front of the listener, as was showed in that earlier shoe diagram. The SPL level for the left and the right channel for all three of these bunnies is the same because of how they've been set up. And what that means is all three bunnies are hearing that center image, that phantom image, in the exact same location. So even though the longest paths are associated with the most, so remember, noting that the longest paths are associated with the most on-axis angle, the reduced level due to distance is compensated for by the increased level from that directivity of being more on-axis. And so you can see the center image doesn't change with this.
This is something I'd like to sit here and experience it in real life. I know you're saying this. I know it works out with the theory, but to actually be able to sit here and go across a couch, 3 seats, and have a speaker set up properly, where that's a narrow dispersion speaker, and be able to achieve a similar phantom center no matter where you sit would be really incredible.
It's a neat trick. I mean, I will say I'm presenting this as a perfect scenario. So there's no such thing as a perfect speaker. And I would say amongst directivity control designs, there's a lot of flawed ones out there.
Mm-hmm.
So you really need to be talking about really good constant directivity speakers for this to work right. I would say the less good ones probably work over a narrower zone. The best of them work over a much wider zone. I'm going to show some frequency responses of different speakers to kind of give some examples of how this works in practice. But
so if this is true, then why do you, when you read Floyd Toole's book on sound reproduction and loudspeakers, he talks about how stereo is a flawed concept and you need to have really an LCR. You need to have a center channel, so that way you have an anchored center image no matter where you sit. So if this is true, then you don't need the center.
You do still. So in the book, he also talks about the other flaws. So I'm only showing you one flaw, which is that the center image moves around. The other flaw with stereo is that all of the interactions with the room, basically, it's not even that. All of the spatial cues of the music are trying to be reproduced by either what's recorded in the recording, which, again, spatial cues are 3-dimensional. They're what's happening all around you. They're not what's in the recording. So what's in the recording can't really recreate those spatial cues. So it's relying on the room itself to trick you into thinking you're hearing those as if they're in that much larger space, but they're not. And it's relying on two sources to recreate all of the spatial cues of an entire band that's, this musical performance that's in front of you. So the advantage of a center channel is that its interaction with the room is more consistent with what a center placed source would have been versus the phantom image, for which there are no reflections in the room relative to that phantom image because it's not a real source.
And we have a separate video. You guys can, I'll link it up in here as well, that talks about how, surround sound is really the way to go if you want to have accurate reproduction of a musical event as opposed to 2-channel. We have a whole thing about why 2-channel is limited, even though we love 2-channel. But if you can have a really properly done 5.1 system, there's huge advantages to it. And we do have a video that talks about that.
So what I'm showing here is the frequency response that you're getting in this particular example. So here's the person sitting. This is just 15 degrees off axis from the speakers with that extreme toe angle. And you can see the response at 15 degrees on this particular speaker, which is the, I use the JTR since I've been reviewing them. This is actually the Noesis 212 RT. And that particular speaker has a pretty decent measured response. So you can see it's very flat at just 15 degrees off axis. So sitting in that money seat, if you will, with this extreme toe, you can see you're getting a very flat response. And in this example, I'm showing you the angles and distance are identical, so the response will be the same for each speaker. It's when you start to move to the sides that you can run into problems. Mm-hmm. So we'll show that in the next slide, I believe. Yes. So now you've moved over, and we've got that. Now what we have is 15 degrees and 30 degrees. And so you can see that the one channel where you're getting 30 degrees because you've shifted over, it doesn't look as good. It doesn't look bad, though. And I'm going to show you what these look like overlaid, because I think this kind of almost looks like it's exaggerating it. It's only about a 1 to 2 dB difference that you're seeing. It's just creating that kind of sag there. And then the high frequencies roll off a little bit more above 15 kilohertz. What's going on above 15 kilohertz is probably totally inaudible. And that little dip that you're seeing there certainly probably is a little bit audible, but it's not a huge difference. So for the most part, what you're seeing is a very similar response. They're not identical, but they're very similar. But you've been able to take advantage of the time intensity training in this case to allow that center image to stay right in the middle, even though you've shifted dramatically. I mean, if you work out the math on this, I think I worked out as like at the distance that I sit, it's like 4 feet to the left. So it's actually a pretty big difference to get that degree change. Mm-hmm. So I'm making this extreme on purpose. Now, okay. These are my speakers. So I just wanted to show a better one. Unfortunately, I lost the data to my speakers. I need to pull them out at some point and remeasure them. So these are the old images I have that are from Getty's processing of them. But those are my speakers. And what you can see is those are the two angles, same angles. The frequency response looks almost identical between the two of those. There's almost no difference between it. And so this is a better, even better yet speaker in that regard. And it shows you that you get all the advantages moving over these extreme distances to be able to maintain that constant center image without as extreme of a change in frequency response. So I would say the JTRs are very good, much better than you typically would see from most speakers. This is excellent. This is like almost as good as it gets. There's very few speakers that look this good as you move off axis.
What's the white trace on these graphs?
That's the directivity index. So that's just showing you what the DI looks like. It just happened to be in the images. It's not probably super important for this. I will say that's very flat and very smooth. So a sign of how good a speaker it is.
Yeah. And we do these kind of measurements when we do the spinorama measurements on our loudspeaker reviews. You guys could check out.
Right, exactly. So now this is a exact opposite speaker. So this is the Philharmonic BMRs, a very, very wide dispersion speaker where the response changes almost none as you move around. And this is an unusually good wide dispersion speaker. I mean, most of them do not look this good as you move around these extreme angles. Because the levels are not changing as you move off axis and you get closer to the one speaker, you can see that there's now a 3 dB imbalance and it's caused the center image to shift. So in this particular case, as you move to the side, the center image shifts. So this is, kind of contrary to what people typically say, which is that a wide dispersion speaker has a wider sweet spot. What I'm showing you here is that if we define sweet spot as the spot at which the center image is in the right location, The wide dispersion speaker actually has a worse, much narrower sweet spot. In fact, its only good sweet spot is right in the middle. It's
So
only
I have a philosophical question for you.
Sure.
What is the correct phantom image in this case? Do we want it really at the center between the two speakers, or do we want it relatively to where that listener is, spaced out to the seats, offset? I mean, it would almost think that it would be unnatural for him to now hear the vocals 3 feet over to the right when he's sitting where he is. He would want to see it straight ahead, you know?
Well, I should have created an image like this. So here's a better way to think of it. When you move over to the side like that, that speaker you're closer to still sets the edge of the stage. So what happens is the one side of the stage now is very stretched out. So if you think of it like an orchestra, what that means is that it's almost like there's a black hole on the one side of the stage, and it's stretching out the instruments, making them wider than they really are, covering this huge area. And then the other area relative to the center. So in this particular case, looking at it, it would be flipped around. So center to right. I did that backwards. But anyway, you guys get the point. Center to right, you're seeing a very small area. So everything gets crunched together. So when you say it's unnatural, this actually creates an unnatural sound stage, kind of like in your car when you're sitting way off like that. What happens is you've got this very wide, to the right of you, you've got this very wide stage. To the left of you, you've got a very constrained stage that's basically that area right between the steering wheel and the door of the speaker. And that's about it. I mean, people talk about how like good speakers can like disappear and the soundstage extends beyond them, but not a lot, you know, like maybe a foot. Like they don't disappear that much. So when you've got this massive difference, you want to maintain it. The other way to look at it is if you were watching a band in real life and you're sitting off center from the band's location still is, again, off center to you. True. So you should be sitting off from the center. So I think with music, it can be a little confusing because it seems to make sense. Well, why wouldn't you just want to sit in front of you? But it's because, as I said, it constricts the one side of the soundstage and widens the other side unnaturally. But movies, it's even more obvious. If you've got an actor in the middle of the stage and they're talking, in the screen, I should say, and the center image is the dominant source in that case, and you don't have a center channel, we'll just pretend like we're using stereo for that, then if you're sitting off and the voice moves, then the voice isn't locked to the face that you're seeing. It's now moved to a different position from where the person is.
So if you have a speaker like this and you're just setting it up for 2-channel and you want to have that sweet spot across 3 seats, you almost need different volume level and delay level presets for each chair if you're not going to reposition the speakers.
Yeah, and if you've got multiple people listening at the same time, then you can't do that. I mean, it just means different people hear different things. Now, of course, you can just set up a surround system with these speakers and you're good to go. You wouldn't have that problem anymore. So I don't want to like bag on these like they're bad. I mean, you for home theater, typically you wouldn't do that. You'd use a center. And so if you had this with a center, it's not going to shift the image and things are going to be fine.
Yep, because you have an anchored center channel.
Right. So now we're going to look at a speaker that I pick on all the time, but it's just a good example of a potential problem. So this is the B&W 603 towers that we measured. You can see the frequency response isn't great, and you can see that there's this hole in the treble response that partially goes away when you get more on axis compared to the one side. So I kind of overlaid them so you can see how different the response is. You know, this is a little bit worse. This is between 2 and 3 decibels different between the two. So in this case, not only is this a relatively wide dispersion speaker, you can see that they overlay on top of each other very closely over most of their bandwidth. So with this speaker, the center image is going to move with you, but also the tonal balance is going to change. So essentially part of the image is going to sort of shift in the way it sounds. So this is what happens when speakers don't have the best of off-axis responses. And this one still isn't awful. They can get a lot worse than this. I mean, this is their latest. This is their S3 or the one we just. This is the one we just reviewed. That's I have data for. Yeah, I mean, if you conceivably, if you were to take an even worse speaker than this, you could see much more extreme differences than I'm showing. We don't. I mean, one of the things I want to say, I pick on the B&W, but this isn't an awful speaker. We don't typically review awful speakers that often. So unfortunately, I didn't have data any worse than this.
Okay, that's a good way to say it.
So this goes back to the JTR versus BMR. So the one thing that I've done here, I need to make clear what you're looking at. So here's an example of the responses so you can see their consistency. I've laid them on top of each other. Now, in the case of the BMR, they do lay on top of each other. In the case of the JTR, they actually would be 3 to 6 decibels apart I'm trying to remember. I think it's 6 decibels apart. And what I've done is artificially set them on top of each other just so you can see how close the response really is. So you can see that that's not a big difference. It's about 2 decibels over most of it.
Okay, so just go over the color of the traces here again, the yellow versus the blue. These are the
that's the JTR at the different angles. That would be 15
okay.
degrees and 30 degrees.
Gotcha. Okay,
And
so
then
this is the 30-degree offset where you're losing high frequencies.
yeah, and then with the BMR, what I did, there's 3 there. So I think it's like 15, 30, and maybe 45. I was just trying to point out that speaker's response just doesn't change at like any angle. I mean, literally all the way out to 90 degrees practically, it's the same. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah. Man, that is pretty crazy. That's really wide dispersion. That's like the widest dispersion speaker I think we've ever measured.
It is. What's so impressive about it actually is the tweeter doesn't beam. So there's lots of speakers we reviewed that have very wide dispersion out to like 5 kilohertz, but they typically start to beam after that, and especially after 10 kilohertz. Because of the nature of the ribbon tweeter that was used in this one, it doesn't really beam at high frequencies until well past 20 kilohertz. So you see an unusually wide dispersion all the way across the entire bandwidth of the speaker. It's really actually unusually impressive.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay, so why does narrow dispersion not change volumes? We said earlier wide dispersion does, and we explained why. Well, so again, if a narrow dispersion speaker is defined as one whose volume does change with angle, then why would the person sitting closer to one speaker hear it as just as loud? You know, because if it's getting to be a different volume with angle, why is it actually not changing volume? And the answer to that is because we've traded distance for intensity. So you're getting closer, but you're reducing intensity, it stays the same. Since
you're reducing intensity because the frequency response is dropping off at a sharper angle with a narrow dispersion speaker. So it's compensated for the longer distance from the speaker on the opposite side. That's more on axis, right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people think of narrow dispersion as having these kind of pointy responses, if you will, where like the shape of it becomes more and more sloped. A good narrow dispersion speaker doesn't do that. The response always remains flat. It just gets quieter. So if you look at that JTR and you look at its response, you'll see that there is an angle area between 500 hertz and around 800 hertz. And then from around 800 hertz to, we'll say 15 kilohertz, it's actually flat at almost every angle until you get out to about, I'd say close to 60 degrees off to each side. And then it does start to do that kind of angle shaping again across all the frequencies. But what that means is that you're not seeing a change in tonal balance as you get off axis. You're just seeing it get quieter. And that's what's critical to what's needed for this. You have to have a speaker that's a good constant directivity speaker.
Right. Now, would you place a speaker that's a narrow dispersion speaker? Would you separate them further apart than a speaker that's a wide dispersion speaker?
You don't have to, but you can. I mean, one of the nice things about narrow dispersion speakers is that they can be much closer to the walls because they're going to interact with the wall less. So a wide dispersion speaker is going to be essentially spraying that wall with a lot of sound. And so you're going to get a lot more reflections up the wall, which can cause a lot of potential issues, which is why they often recommend when you place a speaker near a wall, put absorbers up. With a narrow dispersion speaker, the sound is already automatically getting quieter towards the wall. And so you don't necessarily need to have absorbers up, or if you do, it's just to get the absorbers plus effect kind of a thing. So
you're still dealing with bass issues for both speakers when
because they're all wide dispersion in the bass,
right? Yeah.
So yeah, that's true, and that's where we're probably going to talk about these types of speakers more, but that's where you get into like the double Dutch 8Cs and designs like that with cardioid bass, which actually do spray essentially less bass to the sides. Those are less affected by being put towards a boundary, and that is a narrow dispersion speaker, that's using a more advanced approach to extend that dispersion control even lower. But for normal narrow dispersion speakers, you do have that bass problem as you get too close to a wall, but you don't have the reflections problem those discrete reflections problem, I should say, that you typically would have.
Right. And at the bass frequencies, to some extent, you can EQ some of that out.
Yeah, for sure. You should be able to compensate for that.
Yeah.
So now I want to talk about multi-channel, because actually I really think that the narrow directivity's biggest advantage is in multi-channel systems. And it was interesting, after our last video, Sean Olive had sent along a couple of articles that talked about sort of the state of research, if you will, on directivity and people's perceptions. And I had been saying there really isn't a lot there. And the articles basically said there isn't a lot there. There wasn't, there isn't a whole lot to conclude out of it. But one of the conclusions you could make is that there seems to be a preference for narrower dispersion in surround systems. It seems to improve our ability to place images accurately, and when people are asked to kind of indicate which they prefer under blind conditions, they tend to prefer that. I say tend to because it's still a really tiny effect, and there's you can have really good wide dispersion surround systems that seem to work fine. But there's other advantages here that are very technical that I think still merit discussion. So there's a benefit in narrow dispersion surround systems for the following reasons. You have the improved image stability and pan. So I was mentioning earlier, because you get that improved image stability with left to right with a 2-channel system, you also would have that with left to center or center to right, and you would have that also with the left to surround and right to surround type of pan. So you have improved image stability across all the different seats, which by definition means you have a wider sweet spot. There's less room reflections to interfere with the reproduced spatial cues in the mix, because again, you don't want the room spatial cues in a surround system. The surround speakers are producing the spatial cues, so you want to minimize those. Now, our brain's good at ignoring them, and that's nice, but that doesn't mean it's not beneficial to further reduce them.
Now, just to step back for 1 minute, if we're talking about just 2-channel, then your acoustical needs in the room changes pretty significantly.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that there's a lot of people out there who like a basically dead room with no spatial cues, and they just rely on their 2 speakers, but then they got to acknowledge there's no spatial cues in that presentation anymore.
Right.
In a surround system, you want a dead room because the surround speakers are actually handling those. They're providing them
the spatial cues. Yeah.
Right.
But in a 2-channel system, maybe less absorption and a little bit more
typically
in the room.
Typically the preferences are, and again, the research supports the notion that you would want, especially lateral reflections, that you do want to maintain those because they're critical to our perceptions of spatial cues. So without them, you don't have them. I mean, if you don't have those lateral reflections, those 2 speakers can't produce them for you.
Yeah.
So here's where we're going to start talking about. When I say surround speaker, I want to be very, very clear that I'm not talking about surround as in the sort of general sense of a surround system and every speaker is a surround speaker. I mean, literally these surround speakers. So if you have a correctly designed high directivity speaker in your surround positions placed correctly, you can actually help maintain those surround images. So Gene, I'm sure you've experienced this. You get it in theaters sometimes. I think in your own home cinema, it can happen. If you sit really close to one of those surround speakers, like that's all you hear when the effects come and start panning around you. Like you can instantly tell where the speaker is. It pulls your attention away. It's very distracting. And so what that means is if you're in the right perfect position, you've got this great envelopment. It sounds really good. But anyone else who's like too close to one of those surround speakers is not getting that same great experience. And that's because of the problem we talked about earlier. Most surround speakers are pretty wide dispersion. And when they're placed against a wall, they've got all that extra, I mean, essentially there's a mirror image of the speaker off the wall. So you've got all those extra reflections coming. It produces this very wide sound and it tends to call attention to itself. But also when you move, what happens is that issue of it gets louder as you get closer. And the other one that you're getting farther from is getting quieter. So the image that it's trying to create between those two is being shifted with you in an unnatural and inappropriate way. You can use, though, narrow dispersion systems. The speakers themselves can be narrow dispersion such that when you move, that spatial cue, that spatial image, if you will, doesn't shift. So if it's trying to make something like fly around you, it's flying in the correct position.
Yeah, and then the other thing you have to deal with is if you have a multi-row seats going from front row to back row, all your levels are going to shift just going to that back row, and that's a problem when you're dealing with conventional radiating speakers.
It is. And it can be with narrow dispersion, but then that's where you get into potentially using more than one set. So depending on how long your room is, even a home cinema can potentially take advantage of or need really more than one pair of side surround speakers.
Yeah, so like an array of speakers that are properly time delayed.
Yep. And when you do that, though, it's really critical that they're decorrelated, time delayed, and that they are relatively narrow dispersion because you don't want them interacting with each other too much.
Oh, that's a good point, actually. And I've seen that in the past where people have set up like some of the Denon flagships where they had 2 sets of side channels and they use the same wide dispersion speakers. And that could be a recipe for disaster if they're not narrow directivity or, controlled directivity.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of people set them up improperly. Okay, so what have we learned? Well, directivity control can be an important tool for maximizing the sweet spot of a sound system for either 2-channel or surround. Narrow dispersion increases the sweet spot. It does not reduce it. It's the opposite of what most people tend to think. And dispersion control can be valuable for surround speakers. So, there really aren't a lot of what I would call narrow dispersion surround speakers on the market. They're not very common, but there are advantages to them. And I actually wish they were more common. Again, you can't really see it that well, but like coaxials that are designed correctly are particularly good for surround speakers because they have symmetric, the vertical and the horizontal directivity tends to be the same for those. And so you have the advantage of, like, if you have multiple rows of seats, you're not going to necessarily have big problems. Like, you could position them between the rows of seats. So that way each row is getting the same volume level because horizontally they're off by the same amount. But then vertically, if you angle them correctly, what happens is you get that time intensity trading again, where as you get closer to one, you're moving more off axis, so it gets quieter, and you're moving more on axis to the other one in this vertical range, and that it gets louder. And that creates a stable image both front to back and side to side. So I really wish that these types of speakers were more common, but you just don't see it a lot. I think it's because people don't know about this.
Yeah, I think maybe what we should do after your wife has the baby, because Matt's is going to be a expectant father for a second time in the next few days. But after that, after you're all settled with that, maybe we should do another slide presentation just on surround speakers, just what you think the best kind of surround speaker is for the environment that you're trying to set it up for. Excuse me.
Green surround speakers help reduce CO2 levels. And
no, I was thinking just the way that they play into a room. If you have, multiple rows of seats, if you're doing Atmos versus just 5.1,
I think it would be good. I think, to be honest, I have pretty strong opinions on what makes for good surround speakers. And it's another one of those ones where I think most people just kind of get it wrong. I think that their understanding of these things is not where it should be. And I don't blame them. I think that the industry has done a poor job educating people in order to sell a pretty standard type of speaker that is not necessarily optimal for surround. I think you and I actually are in big agreement on this. I think surround speakers have to be able to have a lot of dynamic range to play loud cleanly, whether you listen loud or not, just because the dynamics in movies are pretty significant.
And also we're now finally getting to the point where the manufacturers and the industry in general is stopping to recommend dipole speakers for surround. I mean, I think they had a great purpose when we didn't have discrete surround sound, but they're kind of an antiquated technology now when you're trying to do discrete surround sound and you have multiple speakers. You don't just have 5 speakers in a room anymore. Now you have sometimes 7 or up to 13 or more. You don't want to have so much scattered sound from the surround speakers, and you have no precision at all in how you're steering that information.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, they're getting to a point now where they're starting to design better surround speakers, and things are improving in that regard. I think what remains the biggest issues is that many of them are just not capable of playing loud enough cleanly. And so there's still a lot of systems out there that when played anywhere near, I mean, they don't have to be reference levels. I've seen systems that are a good 6 to 10 decibels below reference levels that are already hitting high distortion and compression by that point. And you hear people complain. They say, yeah, I don't like that movie. It's just the voices are really harsh and everything sounds bad. And then you listen to it and you're like, there's nothing wrong with the movie. That's your speakers. You're just playing too loud.
And that's what made me laugh, and not to get off too far topic, but when the Dolby Atmos enabled speaker came out and they were trying to bounce sound off of the ceiling and they were using a 4-inch whizzer cone driver, like companies were they had large towers and then they would shove a 4-inch whizzer cone driver above that to create the Atmos effect. And now right there, you're limiting the dynamic range of your system to that terribly designed speaker. And that was like my biggest contention I had with that.
Well, and it didn't work all that well. And that actually, I think we did a video on that, but maybe it's even worth rediscussing that at some point in the future, maybe in this next one a little bit. There is like certain design criteria that are necessary for that bouncy house approach to work at all. And I don't know, probably 3/4 of what I've heard so far doesn't meet that criteria, and the effect is not believable.
Yeah. So we'll save that for another topic. I think we'll wrap this video up now. Guys, if you have any questions about what we were talking about, feel free to put them down below. I'm going to make this slideshow readily available on our Patreon channel at patreon.com/audioholics. So make sure you become a member, because you get a lot of perks to get inside information, and you get to see our detailed content there that you don't get to see here. and you don't get to always see on the editorial site. Matt, thanks for coming on tonight, especially with everything going on. And, you know, I'm sure you're nervous about the whole pregnancy thing with your wife. So I appreciate you putting a slideshow together on a weekend for us. That's dedication, guys. This guy is really dedicated to being an audioholic.
Yes, although I want to make sure everybody understands that I've been working on this presentation as part of this trio for quite a while now, and would not ever put my wife and her giving birth at the expense of Audioholics. That is still my priority. And for those that are wondering, she's actually passed her due date by 2 days, so we're hoping any day now, but we'll have to see what happens. So wish me luck.
Yes, well, we're crossing our fingers. We're keeping our thumbs up. All right, guys. So I appreciate you. And until next time, my friends, keep listening.